In 2019, after a difficult period and loss in my life, I decided to seek peace and a change of environment. I found and bought an old house in a remote rural area near Bardstown, Kentucky. The house had age, with creaking wooden floors and the distinct smell of dampness and dust from being vacant for a long time. It stood isolated, with a large backyard, overgrown with weeds and bordering a small patch of woods. The silence here was absolute, completely different from the noisy city I was used to. I hoped this place would bring me tranquility. The first few days passed quite calmly. I spent time cleaning, doing small repairs, and getting used to my new living space. I liked sitting by the window in the evening, reading or simply looking out at the backyard as it plunged into darkness. The silence of the late night in the countryside was profound. Only the sound of night insects and the gentle wind rustling through the trees. It was a silence I craved, but it was that very silence that highlighted the first sound, making me jump. It was around midnight, when I had turned off the lights and was lying in bed. I heard a very faint noise from outside. At first, I wasn't sure what it was, thinking it might be an animal in the woods. I listened closely, trying to distinguish the sound in the darkness. It repeated, a little clearer this time. Not an animal sound, it was the sound of crying. A woman's cry, very soft, very distant, as if trying to be suppressed, but unmistakable. It was the sound of sobbing filled with sorrow. A sudden chill ran down my spine. Who would be out there at midnight, crying alone in this remote backyard? I lay still, holding my breath, trying to pinpoint the direction of the sound. It clearly came from behind the house, from the area of the backyard or the edge of the woods. I tried to rationalize it, maybe a neighbor, though I knew the nearest neighbor was quite far away. Maybe someone passing by, though this was a dead-end road and very few people used it. But no explanation was truly logical. It was the sound of a woman crying, in the darkness, where no one should be. The first fear began to creep into the peace I sought. That cry was not an isolated incident. It repeated in the following nights. Not every night, but often enough to become a haunting. Around midnight or in the early hours of the morning, the mournful sobbing of the woman would echo from behind the house. I listened to it in the darkness, the cry becoming terrifyingly familiar. It was always that cry, suppressed, full of sorrow, as if the grief had seeped into her soul. I started spending my days checking the backyard. I walked around, looked into the bushes, checked the edge of the woods. Nothing unusual, no trace of anyone having been there. Nothing that could make a sound like crying. The yard was just an old yard, overgrown and silent under the sunlight. But when night fell, the crying would begin again. Sometimes it sounded closer, as if the woman was right outside the kitchen window or the dining room window at the back of the house. The feeling of being watched, observed from the back, began to emerge. I no longer felt comfortable walking around in the back rooms at night. Fear and curiosity intertwined. Who was crying? Why were they there? I didn't dare go out at night to check. The isolation of the house, the thick darkness, and the distance of neighbors made the thought too terrifying. I could only stay inside, listening to that haunting cry, trying to find a logical explanation while fear slowly eroded my calmness. That cry only happened at night, and it made me afraid of the darkness of the backyard. It didn't sound like an animal crying. It was definitely a human cry. A woman suffering immense pain. The silence of the house had been broken by the sound of anguish. And I knew, this was not normal. The haunting escalated. The cry from behind the house was no longer simply sobbing. Sometimes it turned into mournful moaning, stifled screams, or heartbreaking, painful gasps. Its tone changed, sometimes sounding like utter despair, sometimes like simmering anger. Along with the crying, other strange sounds began to emanate from the back area. A very faint rustling in the bushes. Even when there was no wind. The sound of light footsteps on dry leaves or dirt, moving slowly along the edge of the backyard. The sudden snap of a dry branch. These sounds were very difficult to pinpoint the source of, and they only appeared when the crying echoed, as if something was moving around out there. The feeling of being watched from behind the house became heavier and more constant. I felt as if someone was standing at the end of the yard, staring at the house, at me. Even during the day, when I went out into the backyard, I still felt an unusual coldness in certain areas, especially near the edge of the woods. That cold wasn't due to the weather. It seemed to radiate from the ground or the air itself. Strange phenomena began to occur inside the house as well, seemingly connected to the haunting outside. The back door, although tightly closed and locked, would sometimes make a light creaking sound or tremble slightly, as if someone was trying to open it from the outside. Small objects on shelves or tables in the back rooms would sometimes inexplicably move position. The temperature in the back rooms was also consistently lower than other rooms in the house. Strange dreams began to disturb my sleep. I dreamt I was in the backyard at night, dark and cold. I heard the crying very close, and sometimes caught a fleeting glimpse of a woman's blurry figure in the darkness. The dream always ended when I felt a wave of sheer terror washing over me. That cry was invading my mind. Even when I was asleep, the haunting became more personal and direct. The cry from behind the house was sometimes no longer just sobbing, but sounded like someone trying to speak. Words distorted, unclear, mixed with the crying. Sometimes, I heard a faint whisper calling my name, very soft, echoing from behind the house. Carried by the wind, the crying now began earlier in the evening. As soon as dusk fell, this turned the night into a nightmare from the moment it began. I decided I had to research the history of the house and this land. Why was that cry here? What happened in the backyard? I asked the oldest neighbors I could find, though they seemed hesitant to talk about the house's past. I searched old local news archives, looking for information about tragedies, deaths, or disappearances that had occurred on or near this property. Gradually, I pieced together some scattered information. Old rumors. This house had stood for hundreds of years, and had witnessed many events. There was an old story, vaguely told through generations of local residents, about a tragedy that occurred on this very land decades ago. A young woman met a tragic end here. Perhaps a murder or a terrible accident. And the story said her death was directly related to the area behind the house, the backyard or the edge of the woods. It was rumored that she had been murdered and her body disposed of there, or she had died in pain and isolation in that area. Knowing the possibility that the cry was from the spirit of the woman who died tragically right in the backyard made everything terrifyingly clear. The reason for her intense haunting was likely her brutal death, the injustice, or her body being buried, abandoned in a remote place. That cry was the sound of suffering, of imprisonment. My research into her seemed to provoke the spirit further. The crying became more intense, more desperate, and sometimes sounded like a furious wail of indignation. The accompanying sounds also became clearer, sounding like struggling, crashing, heavier footsteps. The haunting had gone beyond just sounds and feelings. The woman's spirit was trying to manifest its presence in a more physical way. focusing on the area behind the house and seemingly trying to reach me. When the crying became particularly intense, I started seeing terrifying things in the backyard at night. Fleeting shadows gliding between the trees at the edge of the woods. A blurry, hovering figure, pale white or gray, appearing for a split second and vanishing immediately. Sometimes, I saw a pale face pressed against the kitchen window or the dining room window at the back of the house. Only for a fraction of a second, then disappearing. The eyes were hollow, full of sorrow and anger. The feeling of being watched was no longer just a feeling. It was a physical pressure. I felt as if someone was standing right outside the back door. Their cold breath seeping through the cracks. The back door would sometimes tremble lightly. Or the doorknob would slightly turn down and then back up, as if someone was trying to open it. The crying and moaning sometimes sounded as if it was coming from right behind me. Even when I was inside the house, far from the back windows, intense coldness appeared suddenly and spread rapidly. Objects in the back rooms would inexplicably fall to the floor. Lights would flicker or go out. Dreams now became horrifying nightmares, replaying the woman's tragic moments. I dreamt I was in the backyard at night, dark and cold, witnessing her being attacked, hearing her desperate screams, feeling her pain and fear. I would wake up feeling exhausted, as if I had experienced it myself. That spirit was trying to share, or force me to feel her pain. That cry wasn't just an expression of sorrow. It was a terrifying invitation, or a threat. The haunting reached its peak of horror. The cry from the backyard was no longer just an individual crying sound. It was a symphony of suffering and rage, mixed with sounds of struggle, impact, tearing, as if the tragic moment was constantly being replayed in the backyard. The woman's figure appeared clearer, more terrifying. At the edge of the yard or near the back door, she looked pale, with long disheveled hair, old clothes, and hollow eyes staring straight at me. Perhaps, catching a glimpse of signs of violence or suffering on her. She no longer just stood still. She reached out a hand. Towards the house. Towards me. The sense of pressure around the house became immense. I felt as if an invisible force was trying to break through the final barrier. Violent pounding on the back door. Scratching on the windows, as if something was trying to break in. Sometimes, the crying sounded as if it was coming from underground in the backyard. Like the sound of someone buried and trying to get out. This added to the horror of her fate. That spirit seemed to want something from me. Wanted me to know the truth? Wanted me to help her find justice? Or was she simply too lonely, too heartbroken, and wanted to drag me into her world? The world of imprisonment and pain in the backyard? That cry was a desperate plea. A curse. A threat. On a peak night, when the crying and wailing from the backyard reached an unbearable level, I felt as if the house was shaking. I caught a glimpse of the woman's figure right outside the back living room window. Her eyes fixed on me. And I heard a clear whisper in my mind, "Come with me, it's cold here." Utter terror and survival instinct propelled me. I could not stay in this house anymore. The house was not a place of peace. It was a trap, and the backyard was a living grave. I left the house that very night, abandoning everything. The crying still echoed in my mind as I drove frantically away from the remote dirt road. I escaped the house, but the crying from the backyard still haunts me. On quiet nights, sometimes I still faintly hear a very soft sob, echoing from somewhere in the space. My sleep is disturbed by nightmares of the dark backyard and the woman's pained face. The feeling of being watched, observed from behind, never completely disappears. I know that the spirit of the murdered woman is still there. Trapped in the backyard of that old house in Kentucky. Her crying still echoes in the darkness. A horrifying reminder of an unresolved tragedy. She is still there, waiting, perhaps for anyone foolish enough to move into that house and listen for the cry from the backyard. This story is true. It is what I experienced. It taught me that silence doesn't always mean peace. And there are places in this world that hold the pain and imprisonment of the past, forever haunting those who unknowingly enter their space. If the story of the cry from the backyard sent chills down your spine, if you believe in true horror, spirits trapped by tragedy, and houses holding terrifying secrets, don't forget to subscribe to the channel for the next videos. There are many other horrifying secrets waiting to be told. In 2015, my name changed. A second-year student, moved into a rental room in Boston, Massachusetts. As a student, my budget was limited, so I chose a room in an old building, near the university but affordable. The room wasn't very big. The furniture was simple, but it had a small window overlooking a quiet street and a private attached bathroom. The bathroom was quite small. The tiles were slightly stained. It had an old bathtub and a small opaque window above. I lived alone, and at first, I felt quite satisfied with this privacy. The first few days passed with the normal rhythm of student life, going to class, working part-time, studying. I gradually got used to the sounds of the old building, the creaking wooden floors from the upstairs, the sound of water running in the pipes, the opening and closing doors of other tenants. Everything was just the normal noises of a shared building. But then, one night, as I was lying in bed, getting ready to sleep, I heard a different sound. Very faint, and unfamiliar. I stopped reading my book, listening intently in the silence of the late night. The sound repeated, small, weak, but I gradually recognized what it was. It was the sound of crying. A baby's cry. I frowned. A baby crying? Here. This building was mainly rented by students and single people. I had never heard a baby's cry here before. I tried to pinpoint the source of the sound. It wasn't from outside, nor from the room next door. It seemed to be coming from inside my room. More specifically, from the bathroom. I sat up in bed, my heart pounding faster. A baby crying in the bathroom? That was absurd. Maybe I was mistaken. Maybe it was just the wind whistling through the small bathroom window. Or some strange pipe noise. I tried to ignore it, burying myself under the covers and closing my eyes. But that crying sound still reached my ears. Small, steady, and full of weakness, vulnerability. The first unease began to creep in. The baby's cry didn't stop that night. It returned the next night. And the nights after that. Always at night. Always from the bathroom. Sometimes it was a very faint sob. Sometimes intermittent crying, like a baby who was uncomfortable or hungry. It was the cry of a small, vulnerable being, suffering. I started fearing my bathroom. Every time I walked past the bathroom door at night, I felt a chill. I tried to use the bathroom as quickly as possible before it got completely dark. But the crying would still echo in the night, preventing me from sleeping well. I started checking the bathroom more carefully during the day. Looked in the bathtub, checked the pipes, opened the small window. It overlooked a narrow gap between two buildings. Nothing special. The bathroom still looked normal. Just old. There was nothing that could make a sound like a baby crying. I tried talking to the landlord about the strange noises. He was an elderly man, seemed a bit difficult. He just brushed it off, saying that the old building had many noises and maybe I was just new and not used to it. His attitude made me not dare to specifically say it was a baby crying, afraid he would think I was crazy. I also tried asking some other tenants, those who lived near my room, but they all said they didn't hear any unusual noises, just the usual sounds of the old building. This made me feel isolated with my experience, as if only I was hearing that cry. The crying seemed to only happen when I was alone in the room. If friends came to visit and stayed overnight, the crying wouldn't appear, but as soon as they left, the first night alone, it would start again, as if something in the bathroom only bothered me when I was without company. The fear of the bathroom grew. It felt like there was a terrifying secret hidden within it, and that cry was its way of showing its existence. The baby's cry, weak but persistent, it was unlike any sound I had ever heard. It was full of sorrow, and it echoed from right inside my rental room. The haunting in the bathroom began to become more complex. The baby's cry was no longer simply sobbing. Sometimes, I heard the crying accompanied by other very faint, hard to identify sounds, but they added to the chill. A soft rustling sound, like fabric being dragged across the tile floor in the bathroom. The sound of a very light splash in the bathtub, even though the tub was empty. The sound of shallow breathing, very close. The crying sometimes sounded as if it was moving within the bathroom, as if the baby wasn't staying in one place. Sometimes it sounded near the window, sometimes near the bathtub, sometimes near the bathroom door, as if it was right inside that small space. The feeling of being watched from the bathroom also became stronger. Every time I walked past the closed bathroom door at night, I felt as if someone was watching me through the wooden door. A sudden cold draft would emanate from the crack under the bathroom door. Even though the room temperature was normal, that cold was not normal cold. It was biting cold and carried a damp, heavy feeling. Strange phenomena began to spread outside the bathroom a little. Sometimes, while studying at my desk, I would hear dripping water from inside the bathroom. Even though the faucet was tightly off, I would check, and there was no water dripping. Sometimes, a strange smell would waft by, a stronger than normal musty smell. A faint metallic smell like rust, or another smell hard to describe, like the smell of old stagnant water. Dreams about the baby began to appear in my head. I dreamt of a dark, damp room, hearing the baby cry. Sometimes, I dreamt of a small hand flailing in water. The dreams increased my fear of that cry and the mysterious bathroom. That cry wasn't an illusion. It was real, and it was trying to tell me something about the secret of this rental room. The haunting became more intense and focused on the source of the cry. The baby's cry was sometimes accompanied by faint adult sobbing, very soft, echoing from inside the bathroom, like the cry of a grieving mother. I decided I couldn't keep living with this fear. I needed to find out about the history of this rental room, of this old building. Why was there a baby crying in the bathroom? What had happened here? I tried searching for information about the building's history, strange incidents that occurred at this address, asking other longtime tenants, if accessible, searching online about the address, looking for old newspaper articles. The search wasn't easy, but I did gather some terrifying information. This old building had a history of hundreds of years, and had been used for various purposes. There were old rumors in the area about tragedies that had occurred here. Stories about unsolved deaths. I specifically looked for information related to children or women in this building. Then, I found an old story. A tragedy that occurred decades ago, perhaps in the 1970s or 80s, involving a woman and a baby in this building. The information was very vague, just recounted stories, but it hinted at a tragic death related to abandonment or accident. Perhaps the incident happened in this very rental room, or a similar room in the building. The reason for the intense haunting, the persistent and haunting cry, was likely because the tragedy was too brutal and left immense pain for both the mother, if the story included her, and the baby. Perhaps the baby died in pain, or was hidden after death, and the tiny soul couldn't find peace, forever trapped in the place where its life ended, or where its tiny body was left. The fact that the cry came from the bathroom could imply the manner of death, e.g., drowning in the bathtub, or where the body was hidden, in the bathroom or behind the bathroom wall. Knowing the possibility that a tragedy had occurred right here made my fear concrete and extreme. That cry wasn't a hallucination. It was the echo of a real pain, of a small, trapped soul. The haunting reached its peak of interaction and physical manifestation, focusing completely on the bathroom and seemingly trying to pull me into its world. The baby's cry became intense and continuous, echoing throughout the entire room, no longer confined to the bathroom. Sometimes, the crying sounded like it was right next to my bed, then suddenly echoed from inside the bathroom. The strange phenomena in the bathroom became undeniable. Faucets would turn on by themselves. Icy cold water running strongly into the bathtub or sink. The mirror in the bathroom would sometimes fog up with steam, and blurry marks would appear on it, like tiny fingers pressed against the glass. The strange smell became stronger. A strong musty smell. The smell of stagnant water. And a faint, terrifying metallic smell. I started catching terrifying glimpses. A shadow flitting across the small bathroom window. A blurry, small figure reflected in the bathroom mirror for a moment then vanishing. Sometimes, seeing a tiny hand clinging to the edge of the bathtub in the mirror. Or a small, pale face briefly appearing beneath the water in the tub. The feeling of being pulled towards the bathroom became strong. When the crying was particularly intense, I felt an invisible pull drawing me towards the bathroom door. The coldness from the bathroom spread throughout the room, biting cold to the bone. The crying now sounded like a desperate plea, or an angry demand. Dreams became psychological attacks. I dreamt I was locked in the bathroom. Water rising in the bathtub. Hearing the baby cry around me. Feeling tiny, icy hands touching my skin. I dreamt of the mother's face, full of despair or anger, staring at me from the darkness. I would wake up in utter panic, drenched in cold sweat. That spirit was trying to reenact the tragedy, and wanted me to feel it. The haunting reached its horrifying climax. The baby's cry in the bathroom became a terrifying scream, full of pain and indignation. Along with it were sounds of violent splashing water, struggling, the moaning of an adult, as if the tragedy was actually happening right there in the bathroom at that moment. I looked towards the bathroom door, and glimpsed the door slightly ajar. From inside, a faint light seeped out, and I saw the blurry figure of a woman, her back turned outwards, standing bent over something near the bathtub. Then, the baby's cry erupted, louder than ever before. The feeling of being pulled towards the bathroom became irresistible. Pressure weighed down on my body, as if trying to push me in. I felt as if the air in the room was thick, making it hard to breathe. I knew the baby's spirit, and perhaps the mother's as well, were trapped in this bathroom, bound by the terrible tragedy that happened here. That cry was the sound of suffering, of loneliness, of imprisonment. On a peak night, when the crying and sounds of water reached a frantic level, I saw the bathroom door open wider. From inside, I saw a little more clearly. A small, pale face, wet, with eyes wide with terror, staring directly at me from the edge of the bathtub. Then, a tiny, wet hand reached out, as if trying to grab something. Utter terror helped me regain consciousness. I could not stay here anymore. This bathroom was not a part of the rental room. It was a grave, a trap for souls. I rushed out of the rental room, ran down the stairs, escaped from that terrifying old building. The baby's cry and the sound of water still echoed in my mind as I ran frantically down the street. I left that rental room, leaving everything behind, but the cry in the bathroom haunts me forever. Every time I hear a baby crying in the distance, I flinch. I am afraid of old buildings, small bathrooms, and especially the sound of water running in a bathtub at night. The feeling of being watched from a confined space, the biting cold of the haunted bathroom, never completely disappears. I know that the baby's spirit, and perhaps the mother's spirit as well, are still there, trapped in the bathroom of that old rental room in Boston. The baby's cry still echoes in the night, a horrifying reminder of the tragedy that occurred in that place. A tragedy that no one should have ever known about. This story is true. It is what I experienced during those nights in that old rental room. It taught me that death, especially the death of an innocent life in tragic circumstances, can leave a terrible haunting energy, keeping souls trapped in the place where life ended in pain. If the story of the cry in the bathroom sent chills down your spine, if you believe in true horror, trapped child spirits, and places holding terrifying secrets, don't forget to subscribe to the channel for the next videos. There are many other horrifying secrets waiting to be told. In 2016, name changed. A student, moved to Philadelphia, Pennsylvania to start university life. Finding accommodation near campus and within a student budget wasn't easy. Eventually, I managed to rent a room in an old multi-story house that had been divided into student lodgings. My room was on a middle floor. Quite simple but clean. The house was very old. The wooden floors creaked, and sometimes there were strange noises from the plumbing or the old structure of the building. I accepted that as part of living in a place with history. The top floor of the house seemed rarely used. I seldom saw anyone go up there, and the wooden stairs leading to the top floor were always dark and felt cold. My first few days here were relatively peaceful. Aside from the usual old house noises, I gradually got used to the rhythm of student life away from home, studying, working part-time, trying to make friends. But then, at night, I started hearing other sounds. Not from the plumbing or the building structure. It was footsteps, coming from the floor above, directly above my room's ceiling. At first, I didn't think much of it. I told myself, this building has many rooms. Surely someone is renting upstairs and they're just walking around. Maybe they study late, or they just move around a lot. I tried to ignore it, focus on studying or fall asleep. The footsteps weren't very loud then, just normal walking sounds. But those footsteps repeated in the following nights. They always occurred at night, when everything was relatively quiet. Sometimes it was slow walking, sometimes faster footsteps, like someone pacing in the room above. It always came from the spot directly above my room's ceiling. The regularity of the footsteps started to get my attention. It didn't sound like random movement. Gradually, I noticed these footsteps seemed to only appear when I was in my room. especially when I had turned off the lights. The first sense of unease began to creep in as I looked up at the ceiling in the darkness. The footsteps from the floor above became more frequent and noticeable every night. They were no longer just normal walking sounds. Now, I could hear different types of footsteps more clearly. Sometimes it was heavy walking, stomping down on the floor. Sometimes it was dragging sounds, like something being pulled across the wooden floor. Sometimes it was the sound of running back and forth from one corner to another in the room above. The volume of the footsteps also significantly increased. They got louder and louder, more echoing, as if the person up there was deliberately making noise, or something heavier was moving. At times, the footsteps were so heavy I felt like my ceiling was slightly shaking. I would lie under the covers, listening to the footsteps right above my head, feeling as if someone was walking right on my ceiling. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe the tenant upstairs had a job that required a lot of movement at night? Or they were exercising? But what about the dragging and scraping sounds? And why only at night? I started feeling a sudden cold draft emanating from the ceiling, right under where the footsteps were loudest. This cold was different from normal room temperature. It was biting cold and sent shivers down my spine. It felt as if cold air was spilling down from the floor above. Sometimes, the footsteps up there seemed to react to me. If I moved around in my room below, the footsteps above also seemed to change pace, as if they were following my movements. If I lay still, the footsteps also seemed to slow down, or stop right above me, followed by a heavy silence, giving me the feeling that someone was standing up there, looking down through the ceiling. The fear of the floor above, of something being up there, grew stronger. I started obsessing over my ceiling. The footsteps from the floor above became unbearable. They echoed every night, lasting for hours, with increasing volume and intensity. Sounds like running footsteps, heavy stomping, dragging heavy objects. At times, I heard sounds like heavy thuds or impacts from up there, making me jump. Clearly, these were not the sounds of normal tenants. Anxiety and fear weighed heavily on me. I couldn't sleep well. My studies were affected. I decided I had to talk to the landlady about the noise from upstairs. The next morning, I met the landlady on the ground floor. She was a kind middle-aged woman. I told her about the footsteps and strange noises from the floor above every night. How they were getting louder and more disturbing. The landlady listened to me, her face initially normal, then gradually shifting to surprise, confusion, and finally turning pale with fear. She stared at me, her voice stammering. The floor above? But no one is renting up there. Dear, the top floor is vacant, has been for months. The landlady's words hit me like a lightning bolt. My whole body froze. The top floor is vacant? No one is living there? So what was making those footsteps? My face turned pale. My body trembled uncontrollably. Real, icy cold fear washed over me, completely replacing the initial annoyance. I tried to describe to the landlady in more detail the footsteps I had been hearing, walking, running, dragging, slamming. As she listened, her face grew more and more fearful. She looked up at the ceiling, then back at me with worried eyes, as if she too was starting to feel the creepiness. She admitted that she couldn't explain those sounds either. The horrifying truth was confirmed. Something non-human was walking on the empty floor directly above my room. Knowing the floor was empty made the footsteps utterly terrifying. Now, every sound from above was proof of a supernatural presence. The footsteps echoed every night, louder, more aggressive, and felt deliberate. Sounds of dragging and scraping directly above my room were frequent, sometimes sounding like heavy furniture or even a body being dragged. In addition to that were new sounds, faint whispers, groaning, crying, or even muffled screams, seeming to push down through the ceiling. Not just sounds. I began to feel a physical pressure from the ceiling. A heavy, oppressive feeling, as if an invisible weight was pressing down on my room. The coldness from the ceiling also became more intense, radiating throughout the room. At times, I felt as if streams of biting cold air were flowing down from the ceiling. Strange phenomena started happening in my room, directly linked to the activity above. Dust and small debris from the ceiling would occasionally fall to the floor inexplicably. Even when I wasn't doing anything, objects on shelves near the ceiling would sometimes rattle violently or fall to the floor when the footsteps above were particularly heavy. The light in my room flickered or went out when the activity up there reached its peak. Utter terror weighed down on my mind. I had trouble sleeping. My studies were affected. I was obsessed with my ceiling, always looking up, waiting, afraid of when the footsteps would start again. It felt as if the thing up there knew I was down here, and it was trying to reach me, or simply wanted to scare me to death. My dreams were now filled with the sound of footsteps and images of the dark, empty room upstairs. The disturbance from the floor above became an attack on my peace. The footsteps, dragging, pounding echoed almost constantly at night, accompanied by moaning, crying, or very faint muttering filtering down. I and the landlady, now both scared, decided we had to find out about the history of this house and especially that vacant top floor. What had happened up there to make it so intensely haunted? We asked former tenants, if reachable. Asked the oldest neighbors who had lived here for a long time. Searched local news archives for the house address. Looked for stories of strange incidents or tragedies that had occurred. Gradually, we pieced together a horrifying story. Many years ago, perhaps in the 1980s or 90s, a tragedy occurred on the top floor of this house. A tenant was brutally murdered up there. The case was perhaps never solved or was forgotten over time. It was rumored that the victim had tried to escape, struggled on the floor, and was finally killed right on that floor. Perhaps the body was dragged away or hidden somewhere on that floor. The reason for the intense haunting, the persistent and violent footsteps, was likely because the victim's spirit was trapped there, forever reliving the final moments of their life, the sound of fleeing footsteps, the struggle, the dragging of the body. Their anger and suffering were confined to the vacant floor, and they reacted strongly when someone was living directly below. Knowing the truth turned my fear into utter horror. I was living directly beneath where a murder had happened, and the thing walking up there was the victim's spirit. Her anger and suffering seemed to be directed at me. The haunting intensified after we researched. The footsteps became more frantic. The pounding on the floor above seemed to want to make the ceiling collapse. In a move to ensure my safety, the landlady, being too scared, decided to move me to a different room on the ground floor, where there were other tenants around, hoping that the crowd would make me feel safer and help me escape the haunting from upstairs. I moved down to the room on the ground floor, feeling an initial sense of relief. The new room was smaller, but located between other occupied rooms, and far from the terrifying top floor. The first night in the new room, I tried to relax, hoping the nightmare was over. The noises of the old building and other tenants seemed normal, safe, but as the night got late, and everything grew quiet, I heard it again, faint, but unmistakable, footsteps. I flinched. It couldn't be from the top floor anymore. This location was too far. The footsteps seemed to be coming from somewhere closer. Sometimes it sounded like it was from the hallway right outside my new room. Sometimes it sounded like it was from the room directly above my new room, even if that room was occupied by a normal tenant. The pattern was wrong. At times, more terrifyingly, it sounded like footsteps gliding inside the wall next to my bed. The haunting had followed me. It wasn't just confined to my old room or the top floor. The spirit of the murder victim, or something related to it, had become aware of my existence and didn't want to let go. The footsteps, her terrifying manifestation, were now clinging to me, moving around where I was located. Other phenomena also appeared in the new room. Sudden cold drafts, the feeling of being watched, very faint rustling when no one was nearby, although not as intense as when I was directly under the haunted floor. The fact that it followed me was enough to drive me insane with fear. The landlady was also scared when I told her about what was happening in the new room. But she didn't know what else to do. I knew I couldn't stay in this house anymore. No room was safe. That spirit, or the force tied to it, had targeted me. Finally, I decided to leave the old rental house in Philadelphia, abandoning my studies at that university, all just to escape the haunting footsteps. I left that house, but the footsteps from the floor above never truly left my mind. On quiet nights, when alone, I still flinch, listening, imagining footsteps on the ceiling, the sound of dragging on a wooden floor. I have become afraid of old buildings, rental rooms, and especially the sound of footsteps when I am alone. I know that the spirit of the murder victim is still trapped on the top floor of that old rental house. She still walks, forever repeating the painful final moments. And the horrifying truth is, perhaps, my having heard it, having researched her, caused a part of that haunting to cling to me, following me wherever I go. Those real footsteps, now, are a permanent reminder of the horror I experienced. This story is true. It is what I experienced as a student renting a room in Philadelphia. It taught me that death, especially violent and forgotten death, can hold a spirit captive, turning what was once a living space into a horrifying trap for anyone who unknowingly enters its orbit. In 2017, name changed, decided to move in alone into an old house in suburban Ellicott City, Maryland. After a difficult and tiring period in my personal life, I needed a change, a quiet place to reflect and start over. This house was old, looked a bit worn but had a pleasant exterior and a spacious yard. The yard was a bit overgrown, especially in the back, and right in the middle of the front yard was an old stone bench, looking quite sturdy and seemingly having been there for a very long time. The first few days here were quite peaceful. I spent time cleaning, arranging my belongings, and getting used to the quietness of the house. In the evening, I liked sitting by the living room window, looking out at the front yard under the dim yellow light from a distant street lamp. However, I was someone who had trouble sleeping. Thoughts and worries often haunted me at night. There were nights when, despite being very tired, I would lie awake in bed, unable to fall asleep. My bedroom was on the second floor, with a large window that looked directly down onto the front yard and the stone bench. On one such night, when it was past midnight and I was still awake, I turned to look out the bedroom window. The front yard was pitch dark, with only faint moonlight and weak light from the street filtering in. And then, I saw her, sitting on the stone bench in the middle of the yard. A shape, a woman. I rubbed my eyes. thinking I was mistaken. Must be the shadow of trees or some object. But no, the shape was too clear. It was a woman, sitting upright on the stone bench. My whole body froze. Who would be sitting on the stone bench in my yard at midnight? I looked closer, my heart pounding faster. The figure didn't move, and then I realized the strangest and most terrifying thing. I could only see the upper part of her body. Sitting on the stone bench. Below the bench line, there were no legs, no lower body. It was as if she only existed from the waist up, and was placed sitting on the stone bench. A half-bodied ghost. I quickly pulled the curtains shut, trembling uncontrollably. My eyes were still fixed on the terrifying image I had just seen. A half-bodied ghost sitting on the stone bench in my yard. It was completely absurd, but I knew I hadn't imagined it. Utter terror welled up, icy cold to the bone. That night, I didn't dare look out the window again. Seeing the half-bodied ghost on the stone bench was not a one-time occurrence. It repeated, not every night, but whenever I had trouble sleeping and accidentally or intentionally looked out the bedroom window late at night. She would be there. Always sitting on the stone bench. Always just the upper part of her body. I watched her through the window pane. In the darkness and moonlight. She wore a long, dark dress, looking quite old and simple. Long black hair, usually flowing down her shoulders. Her face was usually turned straight forward, looking into nothingness, with no discernible expression. She was always motionless. Sitting upright, her hands placed on her lap or the edge of the bench. I tried to explain this rationally during the day. Perhaps it was just an illusion due to lack of sleep and stress. Perhaps the light and shadow at night created that strange image. I went down to the yard, checked the stone bench. It was just a normal stone bench. Cold to the touch, nothing unusual. I tried to find out if anyone had ever sat there for a long time, or if there was any story related to this bench, but found nothing. However, every time night fell and I was alone in my room, the fear returned. The thought of her, sitting out there on the stone bench, looking at the house, made me feel unsafe in my own private space. I started avoiding looking out the window at night, trying to close my eyes and sleep. But curiosity and fear often won. The feeling of being watched began to emerge, not just from the yard but from the stone bench itself. Even during the day, when walking past the window overlooking the yard, I still felt an unusual cold draft radiating from the direction of the stone bench. And the feeling that someone was looking up from there, even though it was completely empty. The stone bench, which was just a decorative object in the yard, had now become the center of my fear. The haunting escalated, no longer just seeing the ghost sitting on the stone bench. Her presence began to affect the surroundings. The half-bodied ghost appeared more frequently at night, sometimes sitting there for hours on end. Her figure was a little clearer, showing more detail of her clothes and hair. Her stillness became more terrifying, as if she wasn't a person sitting, but a ghostly statue, permanently fixed to the stone bench. Sometimes, I felt as if her head tilted slightly, or her hand twitched, but very subtly, making me wonder if it was real or just my imagination. A strange silence enveloped the yard when she appeared. The sounds of night insects, the wind, all seemed to stop. An eerie silence, as if the air was compressed. Along with the silence were very faint sounds from the direction of the stone bench, a soft rustling sound like fabric rubbing. A mournful sigh, or faint, unintelligible muttering carried by the wind. These sounds were very small, hard to hear clearly, but they added to the creepiness of the scene. The feeling of being watched from the yard became heavier. spreading throughout my room. It felt as if she wasn't just sitting there, but her invisible gaze was looking through the window, through the walls, looking at me. The cold draft from the direction of the stone bench became stronger, radiating more distinctly. Dreams about the stone bench began to disturb my sleep. I dreamt I was sitting on that stone bench at night, cold and lonely. I dreamt of her sitting next to me, or standing staring at me. The dreams were full of coldness and fear. The stone bench, which was inanimate, had now become a terrifying object, linked to the haunting spirit. The haunting became more personalized. The half-bodied ghost on the stone bench sometimes turned her head towards my room window. I couldn't see her face clearly in the darkness, but the feeling of empty eyes staring directly at me was unmistakable. Sometimes, her hand would twitch slightly, as if reaching out to wave or point at me. The sounds from the direction of the stone bench became clearer, faint whispers calling my name. Very soft, very distant, but I was sure I heard my name. The moaning and sobbing now sounded full of despair, as if pleading for something. I decided I had to research the history of this house, of this stone bench. Why was there a spirit sitting there? And why in such a strange form? I asked the older neighbors, though they were very secretive about the house's past. Searched local archives for the house address. Looked for stories of tragedies, deaths, or unusual events that had occurred on or near this property, especially in the front yard area. Gradually, I gathered some fragmented stories, old rumors. This house had a long history and had belonged to many owners. There was a story, not widely told, about a tragedy that occurred right in this yard many years ago. A woman met a tragic end right here, and the story hinted at the stone bench. Perhaps, she was sitting on this stone bench in the final moments of her life. Or, something terrible happened to her on or near this stone bench, and her lower body was no longer intact or was hidden. The reason for her spirit being trapped on the stone bench, and appearing in a half-bodied form, was likely due to a tragic and violent death, or her body being treated in a terrible way, preventing her from moving on and forever binding her to the place where her life ended. In the incomplete form of death, the crying, the moaning was the sound of her pain and imprisonment. Knowing this story increased the horror. The haunting seemed to react to my research. The half-bodied ghost on the stone bench appeared every night, and sometimes seemed to sit up straighter, as if paying attention to me. The haunting escalated to a new level, going beyond just sitting on the stone bench. The half-bodied ghost of the woman began to leave the bench. I saw her hovering right next to the stone bench, her form still just the upper body from the waist up. Below was blurriness or cold air. She didn't walk or stand, but glided slowly across the front yard, hovering a certain distance above the ground, as if her lower body was still missing or stuck somewhere. Her appearance was clearer, showing details on her face, pale, gaunt, eyes wide with loneliness or pain. Signs of the tragedy might be visible on her. She glided across the yard, sometimes heading towards the house, towards my room window. The sounds from the yard became more chaotic, crying, moaning, whispering mixed together, accompanied by a light scraping sound on the grass or rustling as she moved. The feeling of being watched became suffocating, as if she was right outside, lurking. Poltergeist activity began to occur in my room and the front rooms of the house overlooking the yard. Objects on bookshelves rattled violently. Pictures on the wall tilted. Windows shook gently as she glided past outside. The room temperature dropped suddenly, especially near the window. The ghost sometimes glided right up to my room window on the second floor. Just inches away from the glass, I saw her pale face, her eyes fixed on me, and felt as if she was looking right through me. She raised a pale, thin hand, pressing it against the window pane, leaving a cold, misty print. She would whisper my name, the cold whisper echoing from outside. Dreams became terrifying and vivid nightmares. I dreamt I was in the yard at night, being chased by the half-bodied ghost. I dreamt of her pulling me towards the stone bench, or trying to make me sit on it with her. I dreamt of the moment of her tragedy, seeing the pain and horror in her eyes. That spirit wasn't just trapped. She was searching for something. And perhaps, she wanted me to join her in her tragedy. The haunting reached its peak of horror and violence. The half-bodied ghost of the woman was now fully active and terrifying in the yard. Perhaps appearing more substantial, she might appear to rise from the ground near the bench, or attempt to recreate the moment of her death, burial in the yard. The sounds from the yard were a cacophony of despair and rage, perhaps mixed with the sounds of the violent act that killed her. The ghost attempted direct interaction, trying to force open a front door or window, reaching a pale hand towards the glass, trying to pull it out. The half-bodied aspect might become more horrifying, showing the unnatural way she ended at the waist, or suggesting she was buried from the waist down nearby. An intense struggle for survival inside the house, fighting against the entity's attempts to get in or draw her out. Managed to escape the house, leaving the ghost on the bench and the terror in the yard behind. Lingering trauma, haunted by the sight of the ghost on the bench. The half-bodied form, the sounds from the yard, fear of benches, yards at night, windows, being alone. The haunting might subtly follow her, or she's left permanently psychologically damaged, always seeing the ghost out of the corner of her eye or in reflections. The bench remains occupied in her memory, or perhaps in reality. Ambiguous ending. Did she escape? Is the ghost still there? I escaped that house, but the ghost on the stone bench haunts me forever. Every time I see a stone bench in a park or garden, I flinch. I am afraid of empty yards at night, afraid of lonely stone benches under the moonlight. The image of the half-bodied woman sitting there, cold and lonely, is etched into my mind. The feeling of being watched, observed from afar, never completely disappears. Sometimes, I catch a glimpse of a shadow flitting across my peripheral vision, or feel a sudden coldness somewhere. And in that moment, I see her again, sitting on the stone bench, looking towards me. I know that the spirit of the woman who died tragically is still trapped on the stone bench in the yard of that old house in Maryland. She is still sitting there, forever in her incomplete form, imprisoned by her death. And the horrifying truth is, perhaps, my having seen her, having known about her existence, caused a part of that haunting to cling to me, following me wherever I go. That stone bench, now, is a permanent reminder of the horror I experienced. This story is true. It is what I experienced living alone in that old house. It taught me that death, especially violent death leaving an incomplete form, can hold a soul captive in the place where life ended, turning a normal object into a horrifying symbol of eternal imprisonment. If the story of the half-bodied ghost on the stone bench sent chills down your spine, my husband is Mr. Baugh, name changed. And I am Mrs. Lan, name changed. We are elderly now. Our children have their own families and live in the city far away. My husband and I live quietly in our old house in the peaceful suburbs near Lancaster, Pennsylvania. The house has been with us for many years. With a small backyard. Next door is another house. Also old, with a large yard and a very large, ancient tree. Its branches leafy and shading a whole corner of their yard. The neighbors there change constantly. And we don't interact much. The house next door often feels quite vacant. One night, it rained very heavily. The wind howled in gusts. Lightning flashed, and the rain hammered against the roof and windows loudly. It was a fierce night storm. We were used to storms here. But that night, something was very different. Mr. Ba and I were lying in bed, trying to sleep amidst the noise of the storm. Suddenly, mixed in with the howling wind and roaring rain, I heard another sound, a sound that didn't belong to the storm. At first, it was very hard to distinguish, drowned out by the wind and rain. But it repeated, a little clearer this time. It wasn't an animal sound, not the sound of a breaking branch. It was a human sound. It was yelling, agonizing, full of pain and fear. My heart pounded. Who would be yelling out there in this storm? I turned to look at Mr. Ba. Saw that he too had opened his eyes. His face tense. Listening, the yelling got louder and louder, echoing through the rain and wind. And we realized it was screaming. The scream of a woman. A scream full of utter terror and despair. As if facing something horrific. Where was it coming from? We listened closely, trying to pinpoint it. It was clearly coming from outside our house. From the backyard of the neighbor's house. More precisely, from the location of that large, ancient tree. Mr. Ba and I sat up in bed. Despite our age, we felt a cold fear creeping in. That scream. Under the ancient tree next door, in this fierce storm. What was happening? I looked out the window. The screen of rain was a white blur. Only vaguely seeing the large tree swaying in the storm. Nothing else. We tried to rationalize it. Perhaps someone in trouble? Trapped in the storm? But that scream was too unnatural. It was full of utter anguish. The real fear began from that stormy night. The scream didn't stop immediately. It continued to echo, piercing through the roar of the storm. Different lengths of screams, sometimes sounding like pleading, sometimes like struggling, sometimes like a final, desperate shriek. We sat in our house, helpless, listening to the horror unfolding right next door. Mr. Ba tried to reassure me, saying that perhaps someone in the neighbor's house was having some trouble. Should we call the police? But calling the police because we heard screaming in the neighbor's house at midnight during a rainstorm seemed a bit much. Besides, through the rain and darkness, we weren't entirely sure what we were hearing. The scream sounded very much like a young woman screaming. It was full of vulnerability but also resilience in despair. It only came from the area of that ancient tree, not moving anywhere else. The storm eventually subsided, and the sound of rain and wind died down. As the noise of nature quieted, the screaming also gradually faded, as if carried away by the storm. An eerie silence enveloped the backyard of the neighbor's house again. The next morning, when the rain had stopped, we looked outside. The neighbor's backyard looked completely normal. The ancient tree still stood there, its branches ruffled by the wind. There were no signs of disturbance. No one was there. Nothing unusual. The neighbor's house was silent. We hesitated, not daring to go over and ask, reluctant to recount hearing screams in the night. Did the neighbors hear anything? Or was it just us? The normalcy of the daytime was a complete contrast to the horror of the stormy night. We wondered if we had mistaken the sounds due to the storm and our age? But that scream was too real. Too haunting to be a hallucination. The fear of the neighbor's backyard, especially that ancient tree, began to creep into our minds. From then on, every time there was a strong wind or it looked like rain, we felt uneasy looking out towards that side. The scream from the neighbor's ancient tree didn't only happen during that storm. It returned, occasionally, on late nights, even when there wasn't a big rainstorm. We would still hear it. Although not as intense as during the storm, it was still that scream, full of utter pain and fear, echoing from the area of the ancient tree. The scream was clearer now, less obscured by natural noise. It was clearly a young woman's voice, replaying hauntingly. Accompanying the scream were other very faint sounds from the area near the tree, rustling on the ground, even without wind. Soft thuds, dragging sounds. These sounds only appeared when the scream echoed, as if they were part of an event being replayed. The feeling of being watched began to emerge, not just from the tree but from the entire backyard of the neighbor's house. Even during the day, when walking in our own yard, we still felt an unusual coldness radiating from the shared fence line with the neighbor's yard, especially near the area of the ancient tree. Strange phenomena began to spill over into our house a little. Objects on windowsills or tables near the shared fence would sometimes shake slightly or move position inexplicably when the scream from next door echoed. Sudden drafts of cold air would appear in the house, especially in the back rooms adjacent to the neighbor's yard. Dreams about the neighbor's backyard began to haunt our sleep. We dreamt of that ancient tree in the darkness, dreamt of a blurry figure under the tree, hearing the scream very close. The dreams were full of fear and a sense of imprisonment. That scream was not an animal sound, not the wind. It was the echo of a terrible tragedy trapped there, right next door to us. The screams and accompanying sounds from the neighbor's ancient tree became more frequent and clearer. Sometimes, the screams were accompanied by muttering, moaning, or very faint pleading, but we couldn't make out the words. We knew we couldn't continue living with this fear. Something very bad had happened in the neighbor's backyard, related to that ancient tree. We decided we had to find out about the history of that property. Despite our age, we tried to find information, asked the oldest neighbors in the area. Many seemed evasive or unwilling to talk about the house's past. Searched old local news archives for the neighbor's address. Looked for stories of murders, unusual deaths, disappearances that had occurred here many years ago. Gradually, we pieced together fragmented information. Old rumors whispered among the elderly residents. The story spoke of a tragedy that occurred at the neighbor's house, or on that very land, decades ago. A murder. A young woman was brutally murdered. Details about the killer and the crime were unclear, but the rumor persisted that the victim's body had been disposed of, buried somewhere in the backyard of that house, under the large ancient tree. The reason for the intense haunting, the persistent and agonizing screams, was likely because the death was so brutal, unjust, and the victim's spirit was trapped in the place where she was hidden, forever repeating the final moments of pain and despair, trying to call for help or seek justice. That ancient tree was the horrifying marker of her unofficial grave. Knowing the truth turned our fear into utter horror. We were living next to an unmarked grave, where the vengeful spirit of a murder victim was trapped, and the scream we heard was the echo of her pain and indignation. The haunting intensified after we researched, as if the spirit knew we had learned her secret, and she was trying to make her presence known more forcefully. The haunting from the neighbor's ancient tree reached the peak of physical manifestation. The screams were no longer just sounds. Sometimes we began to catch terrifying glimpses of images in the neighbor's backyard at night. Under the moonlight or dim street lights, we saw a blurry, murky figure under the ancient tree. Not clear, but looked like the shape of a woman, standing still or gliding very faintly around the base of the tree. Sometimes, we caught a fleeting glimpse of a pale, blurry face, as if looking towards our house from under the tree. The face was full of anguish or indignation. The screaming became more intense than ever, sounding as if it was happening just feet away from our shared fence line, even as if echoing from within our own house. Accompanying the scream were sounds of a more violent struggle. Crashing, impact, the sound of earth being disturbed, as if the horrifying scene was replaying right there, under the tree. The feeling of being watched from the backyard became suffocating and constant. We felt as if that spirit was right outside, trying to cross the property line to reach us. The biting cold radiating from the shared fence line became more intense, making the back rooms of our house icy cold. Poltergeist activity began to strongly affect our house. Objects on the walls fell. Windows in the back rattled violently. Floorboards creaked loudly as if someone was walking on the other side of the wall. It was as if the spirit was unleashing its energy, pushing the haunting towards our side of the property line. She seemed to be trying to convey something, not just the scream of pain. Sometimes the scream was accompanied by muttering, disjointed words, like, "Help," "Save," or, "Under the tree." This increased the horror, as if she was trying to recount her story, begging for help or seeking justice. The haunting reached its climax. The scream from the neighbor's ancient tree was now a chaotic symphony of sound. Horrifying shrieks of pain, fear, and utter indignation, mixed with sounds of struggle, impact, tearing, the sound of earth being dug up. The figure of the ghost appeared clearer, more terrifying than ever. Under the ancient tree, it was the blurry image of the woman, perhaps showing clearer injuries, signs of violent death. She was no longer just standing still, she seemed to be replaying the final moments of her life. Struggling, trying to escape something, or trying to reach out towards our house, towards the window where we were watching. The feeling of being pulled towards the neighbor's backyard became strong, as if an invisible force was drawing us towards the tree. The coldness from that side spread throughout the house. Freezing cold. At times, the scream sounded as if it was coming from underground near the base of the tree, like the sound of someone being buried alive. This added to the horror of her fate and her eternal imprisonment. That spirit seemed angry that we were just helpless witnesses. Or she wanted us to experience her fear. Or wanted us to somehow help her find peace. That scream was a curse. A threat. On a peak night, when the screaming and the sounds from under the tree reached an unbearable level, we felt as if our house was under attack. The back door rattled violently. Objects flew off shelves, and the scream echoed as if it was right in our ears. Mr. Baugh and I, old and utterly terrified, could do nothing but try to hide in our house, hoping the nightmare would pass. We called our children, telling them what was happening, but our panicked voices perhaps made them think we were old and delusional. The horror reached its peak and then suddenly subsided. The screaming died down. The ghostly figure vanished. The neighbor's backyard fell into an eerie silence again. After that night, the screaming from the neighbor's ancient tree was no longer as frequent and intense as before. Occasionally, we still hear it, but weaker, more distant, as if the spirit had released some of her pain, or as if she knew that her haunting could not liberate her. However, the haunting never disappeared. We live in constant fear when looking out towards the neighbor's backyard. Especially that ancient tree. Both Mr. Ba and I always have a worried, haunted look on our faces. We no longer dare to walk in the back rooms of the house at night. I know that the spirit of the murdered woman is still trapped under that ancient tree. Her scream still echoes in our minds. A horrifying reminder of the bloody secret buried right next door. That tree is the eternal symbol of imprisonment and pain. This story is true. It is what Mr. Ba and I experienced in our old house. It taught us that crime is never truly buried. And there are spirits trapped by violence, forever repeating their pain, haunting those who unknowingly become witnesses. If the story of the scream from the neighbor's ancient tree sent chills down your spine. In 2018, Anya, name changed, was a nurse working the night shift in the maternity ward of a large hospital in New York City. Night shifts were tough, especially in a specialized ward like maternity. Amidst the regular beeping of machines were the sounds of new mothers' labored breathing and the cries of newborns. I was used to those sounds. Hospital corridors at night were often long, quiet, with only dim lights and the distinct smell of disinfectant. My night shift routine usually involved rounds, checking on the condition of patients and babies. I walked along the long corridor, the dim yellow light reflecting on the clean floor. Everything was happening as usual. As I walked past the area at the end of the corridor, where there were some patient rooms and a shared toilet for visitors and staff, I heard a sound. It didn't sound like the normal cries of babies in the patient rooms. It sounded closer, softer, like a suppressed cry. It was a baby crying. I stopped. Where is that baby crying from? The nearest patient room here didn't have a baby crying. That cry seemed to be coming from the toilet. That was strange. Why would there be a baby crying in the toilet? Maybe someone was in there with a baby? But at this hour? Curiosity, and also my instinct as a nurse, led me to check the toilet area. The toilet door was closed. I could hear the cry clearer through the door. It was definitely a baby crying. I hesitated for a moment, then gently pushed the toilet door open. The dim yellow light from the corridor spilled inside. The toilet was small, had a toilet bowl, a sink, and a small opaque window up high. And it was empty. No one was there. No adult. No baby. A sudden coldness radiated, not normal cold, and the crying stopped abruptly as I opened the door or stepped in. The silence in the empty toilet after the cry I had just heard was terrifying. I stood there, looking around, trying to find an explanation. But there was nothing. A chilling sensation washed over me. That cry was real. But no one was there. I knew I had encountered something supernatural. Scared, I quickly stepped out of the toilet, letting the door close gently. The experience in the toilet that night haunted me. I tried to reassure myself that perhaps due to working the night shift, being tired and stressed, I had misheard. But that cry was too real. In the following night shifts, the baby's cry returned, always from the same toilet area. At certain hours of the night shift, usually after midnight when the hospital was quietest, the cry was soft, intermittent, full of weakness and sorrow. Completely different from the strong cries of healthy babies in the rooms. I started fearing walking past that toilet area during my rounds. Every time I got close, I felt a cold draft radiating. The cold wasn't due to the air conditioning. It was biting cold and carried a heavy, gloomy feeling. The crying sometimes sounded as if it was moving inside the toilet. sometimes near the window, sometimes near the toilet bowl, sometimes as if it was right behind the door, as if the baby was trapped in that small space, unable to get out. I tried to find a logical explanation. Perhaps there was some strange sound system? Or peculiar acoustics echoing from somewhere else? I tried asking some older, long-time night shift nurses about strange sounds in the maternity ward, especially near that end of the corridor. They all looked at me with a puzzled expression, saying they had never heard anything unusual. Only the familiar noises of the hospital at night. However, a few older ones seemed hesitant, only saying vaguely that old hospitals had many strange things. Or, the maternity ward at night is naturally sensitive. Those answers didn't reassure me, instead, they increased my fear. It was as if they knew something but didn't want to say. I started feeling watched from that toilet area. Even when I was far away, working in another part of the ward, I still felt as if invisible eyes were looking at me from the end of the corridor. From where that haunted toilet was located, the fear of the toilet became a persistent haunting during my night shift. The haunting from the toilet began to become more complex and terrifying. The baby's cry was no longer simply sobbing. Sometimes it turned into weak moaning, stifled wailing, or a very faint choking sound, as if the baby was struggling to breathe. Accompanying the crying were other sounds emanating from inside the toilet, adding to the chill, a very light splash, the sound of trickling water, even though no faucet was running. A light scratching sound on the tile floor or wall. A clicking sound like a small object being knocked over. The feeling of being watched from the toilet became stronger, like a physical pressure weighing down on me when I got close to that area. The cold draft radiated stronger, biting cold and carrying a strange smell, disinfectant mixed with another very unpleasant smell. A heavy musty smell, a faint metallic smell like dry blood. Or a very faint, hard to identify foul odor. Strange phenomena began to occur inside the toilet when I was nearby. Sometimes, the hallway light near the toilet flickered or dimmed when the crying echoed. Water in the sink, if the toilet had one, or in the toilet bowl would sometimes slightly ripple. Even though no one touched it. The mirror in the toilet, if there was one, would sometimes inexplicably fog up. Dreams about the baby and the toilet began to disturb my sleep after my shifts. I dreamt I was in a small, damp, dark room, hearing the baby cry around me. I dreamt of a tiny hand flailing in water. I dreamt of a blurry figure of a woman standing near a bathtub or toilet. The dreams were full of despair and fear. That cry wasn't just a sound. It was trying to invade my mind, trying to tell me something about the horrifying secret of that toilet. The haunting became more personal. The baby's cry was sometimes accompanied by a very faint woman's voice. Singing, whispering, mixed in with the cry from the toilet. Sometimes, the cry seemed to be directed at me as I walked past. Like a call or an accusation. I knew I couldn't continue living with this fear without understanding the cause. Something very bad had happened in that toilet area. On this maternity ward, I decided to research the history of the hospital, especially the maternity ward and that end of the corridor. I searched old hospital archives, if accessible through unofficial channels. Asked retired staff, who might know old rumors. Searched local news archives for unusual incidents that occurred at the hospital many years ago. The search was difficult, as hospital information was often kept private. But I gathered fragmented stories. Old rumors about the maternity ward. There were unofficial stories about unfortunate cases. tragic events that had happened here many years ago. Most terrifying were the rumors related to premature births, babies who died shortly after birth, or unwanted births where information was concealed. Specifically, there was a story whispered among old staff about an incident decades ago, perhaps in the 1960s or 70s, involving a woman and a baby. Details were very vague, just retold stories, but it hinted at a tragedy occurring in a private space, possibly a patient room or an auxiliary area of the maternity ward. And the incident involved a baby who did not survive. It was possible that the toilet or the area very close to it was where the tragedy ended. The reason for the intense haunting, the persistent and haunting cry, was likely because the tragedy was so brutal, full of pain, the mother's despair, and the baby's fear or loneliness. Perhaps the baby died unexpectedly, in pain, or was abandoned, and the tiny soul was trapped in the place where its life ended, or where its tiny body was secretly left. The fact that the cry came from the toilet could imply a death involving water or where the body was hidden to cover up the incident. Knowing the possibility that a tragedy occurred right here, in that toilet area, turned my fear into utter horror. That cry wasn't an illusion. It was the echo of a real pain, of a small soul trapped in a narrow, gloomy space. The haunting had gone beyond sounds and cold sensations. The spirit of the baby, and perhaps the mother, were trying to manifest their presence in a more physical way, focusing on the toilet and seemingly trying to attract or pull me in. When the crying became particularly intense, I started seeing terrifying things in the toilet area at night. A small shadow flitting past the crack under the toilet door. A blurry, small figure, reflected in the glass of the opposite patient room door, if any, for a moment then vanishing. Sometimes, seeing a tiny, pale hand placed on the toilet door handle from the inside, then disappearing. The feeling of being pulled towards the toilet became stronger. When the crying reached its peak, I felt an invisible force pulling me towards the end of the corridor. Towards the toilet door. Pressure weighed down on my chest, making it hard to breathe. The cold radiating from the toilet now spread throughout the corridor. Biting cold. Poltergeist activity increased significantly. Sometimes, the toilet door would automatically swing open or slam shut as I walked past. Objects inside the toilet, trash can, toilet paper roll, would sometimes be knocked over. The light inside the toilet flickered frantically. The sound of water running in the toilet or sink would become violently loud, as if someone was flushing repeatedly or trying to wash something away. The crying sometimes sounded as if it was coming from right behind me in the corridor as I walked my rounds, then echo back into the toilet. It was full of despair, pain, and sometimes, like a haunting invitation, "Come in. It's cold here." Dreams became horrifying, vivid, and full of menace. I dreamt I was locked in the toilet, water rising in the bathtub, seeing the baby's small pale face looking up from the water, feeling the tiny hand grasping at me. I dreamt of the mother's face, full of anger or despair, watching. I would wake up in utter panic, drenched in cold sweat. That spirit was trying to replay the tragedy and wanted me to be a part of it. The haunting reached its horrifying climax during a specific night shift. The baby's cry from the toilet area became a frantic scream, full of pain, anger, and utter indignation, mixed with sounds of violent splashing water and struggling. I approached the toilet area. The feeling of pressure and cold was unbearable. The toilet door swung open by itself, revealing a dark and terrifyingly cold space inside. From within, I saw a little more clearly a blurry image. A small, wet, indistinct figure near the toilet bowl or bathtub. And beside it, a glimpse of a taller, blurrier shape of a woman. The crying and the sounds of water surged violently, as if replaying the moment of drowning or being submerged. The feeling of being pulled towards the toilet was irresistible. I felt as if an icy hand was grabbing my ankle, trying to drag me inside. The baby's scream and the mother's moaning seemed to concentrate all their pain, anger, and despair into that small space. They were trapped, and they wanted me to know it. In a peak moment, as I stood at the toilet door, facing the horror within, I saw a small, pale, wet face, with eyes wide with torment, staring straight at me from inside the edge of the bathtub. Accompanying it was the mother's agonizing wail, as if she was accusing someone. Utter terror made me scream. My scream echoed in the quiet hospital corridor. The pressure and terrifying images suddenly vanished. The toilet door gently closed. An eerie silence enveloped the area again. I trembled, gasping for air, soaked in cold sweat. I knew I couldn't continue working the night shift here. Couldn't stay in this hospital anymore. What I had seen and heard would haunt me forever. After that night, I no longer worked the night shift in that maternity ward. I resigned, and it took a long time to recover mentally. The baby's cry from the toilet was etched into my mind. Every time I heard a baby crying somewhere, even if real, I flinched and remembered the horror in the hospital. I am afraid of empty corridors, closed toilet doors, and especially the sound of water running in a bathtub at night. The feeling of being watched from a confined space, the chilling cold of the haunted toilet, never completely disappears. I had to take sedatives to be able to sleep for several days afterwards. And even now, years later, I still sometimes hear that cry echoing in my mind, especially when alone in a quiet space. I know that the baby's spirit and the mother's spirit are still there, trapped in the toilet of that old maternity ward in New York City. They are bound by the terrible tragedy that occurred in that place. A secret hidden in a private space. That toilet is not just a small room. It is the grave of a soul's unreleased pain, forever haunting those sensitive enough to hear the cry from within. This story is true. It is what I experienced as a night shift nurse. It taught me that death, especially tragic and hidden death, can leave a terrible haunting energy, keeping spirits trapped in the place where life ended in pain, turning normal spaces into unexpected repositories of horror. If the story of the cry in the toilet sent chills down your spine, if you believe in true horror, trapped child and mother spirits, and places holding terrifying secrets, don't forget to subscribe to the channel for the next videos. There are many other horrifying secrets waiting to be told.